to host as a keynote Professor Helen Nissenbaum, who is also a great friend of our faculty, center, and a contributor to our community. Helen is a professor in Information Science School at Cornell Tech, and she authored numerous key articles going back even 20, 30 years on issues related to AI, ethics in technology, and other issues. She authored several books, such as Privacy and Context, where she develops the famous theory of contextual integrity, and obfuscation. Let's see if you could say that 10 times. Helen is a PhD in philosophy in Stanford University and has previously been a faculty member in Princeton and NYU. And she will be speaking to us for 30 minutes or so about achieving meaningful privacy through contextual integrity. And thereafter, we will have Q&A, time permitting. Helen, thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. So some of you may know the theory of contextual integrity, and others may not. This is a particular way I've developed of presenting the theory, which I think makes certain aspects of it evident. And I just wanted to, should be okay now. I just wanted to mention that the theory of contextual integrity was not offered and is not offered as a way to understand privacy. It's a way to really grasp what it is that's concerning about certain information practices. I talk about contextual integrity as a theory of privacy because the term privacy has been attached to many of these concerns about the way information technology, and now I use the term data and information interchangeably. I know that there are people who have ideas about the fact that they're different, etc., but for the time being, I use them the same way. So I think some of the confusion that comes about in trying to understand the value of privacy is that we really should be talking about what these concerns are that we should be taking care of. And that's what contextual integrity tries to grasp. So what happened? Okay. So when I talk about meaningful privacy when for those people in the room, or particularly when I'm presenting contextual integrity to technical people in computer science and engineering, because the term privacy is found all over the show in computer science and engineering, but often with a different meaning, with maybe a technical meaning. It could be differential privacy or privacy as anonymity. And what I've tried to do constantly is to say, if you want computer science efforts at representing privacy in systems, like privacy by design, you really need to operationalize or conceptualize privacy in a way that is societally meaningful. And so what contextual integrity, the role it tries to play in the privacy discourse, is as a bridge between what's meaningful in our concerns about data use and the design of systems, whether they be regulatory systems or technical systems, so that they meet together in this meaningful concept or a meaningful concern about what's going on. So I'll talk about privacy as contextual integrity, the theory of it, wave some hands. I'll do less of it given the shrunken time. And then I hope I get to a discussion about why machine learning, and you can say AI, is deeply challenging to contextual integrity, but I think that it's as challenging to many theories of privacy in a similar way. So this is now talking about the theory of contextual integrity, which I'm reducing to 4 claims, 4 fundamental claims that, taken together, are the theory of contextual integrity. And as you see, the way I've organized it is first there's the claim, and then in order to understand the significance of the claim, to also explain what it's not. So in what ways does contextual integrity, is it contrasted with certain other conceptions of privacy? So the first, and by the way, they're a little bit independent in the sense that you can go along with me on this one and then say, yeah, Helen, I really agree with privacy as appropriate flow of information, but after that I disagree with you, and so on. So it kind of builds iteratively from one thesis to the next. So this is the first claim of contextual integrity. Privacy is the appropriate flow of information. And this is because I firmly believe that information flow is a good thing. Society needs information flow. We are social beings. Maybe if you lived completely by yourself, you wouldn't need information flow, but our relationships, our institutions, they are built on information flow, and that is a good thing. And so often in computer science, you'd hear people say, oh, privacy versus utility, privacy versus some other thing. And the point that the starting point of contextual integrity is not that information flow is a problem for privacy, because if we start with that, privacy is already on the back foot. It's already defensive, because then every other good thing that requires information flow, and there are plenty of good things, including friendship and love and family and healthcare, and will require a degradation of privacy, and that's a bad starting place. But what privacy is, or contextual integrity requires, is that the flow is appropriate. So whenever you hear people talk about data minimization or stoppage of flow, like privacy as secrecy, and this is rife in computer science, try and replace that word privacy with information, and then you'll see that they are identifying information must flow and understanding that as a degradation or a violation of privacy. And then you stop them and you say, no, that's fine. What we really care about is appropriate flow. Now, of course, you're saying, yeah, well, that's all very well, but now you've just shifted the problem to what is appropriate flow. And this is now the second phase, or the second thesis, which is that appropriate flow is flow that conforms with contextual informational norms. And as a first approximation, we say entrenched contextual informational norms. We assume, and let me just clarify a little bit here and highlight this notion of context, because after all it's contextual integrity, that we have an assumption that society is not one undifferentiated social space, but rather that social life is performed within contexts, and contexts have are characterized in certain ways. It's nothing mysterious. It's about the context of education, of healthcare, of commerce, and that it's built onto, I didn't invent the idea of social differentiation, rather built this on top of theories. I think yesterday people were talking about Bourdieu, so Bourdieu, social theorists, social philosophers, this is a very common idea. And I would like to, I have built contextual integrity on a rather intuitive notion of context, and also want to reiterate the idea that if we look around ourselves, even if you look at, say, the legal domain, you would see this notion of context quite well entrenched in many different social institutions, political institutions, social institutions. And we have things like family law and commercial law and so on, health law. These reinforce the idea of social life lived in and through social context. And that the context is characterized by, it comprises, it's not like there is a context and then in the context is this, that, and the other thing. It's that contexts are comprised of, are constituted by the roles that are characteristics, the information ontologies that are characteristic, there's certain practices that are characteristic, and there's certain norms. And the norms, of course, regulate behaviors that are acceptable within those contexts, or sometimes what isn't acceptable. And within that sphere of normative behavior are those norms that govern the flow of information within contexts. What is acceptable within contexts? And some of these are explicit, some of them are implicit, some of them are very rigid, some of them are kind of fluid. So these are the informational norms, contextual informational norms. And immediately what we notice is that contextual integrity in taking this approach is immediately different from a code of fair information practice principle, which except if you flesh it out in certain ways, is highly procedural, and the approach of privacy through informed consent is a procedural approach, whereas the contextual integrity approach claims that we have substantive, entrenched norms that govern the flow of information in society. Now, contextual integrity posits a particular structure of informational norms. And I want to just actually connect with something that Victor was talking about earlier, and that is that this idea of a model. So you can think about the structure of informational norms as a model of informational norms. It's a claim that when you're describing informational norms in ways that are relevant to our sense of appropriate flow, you need to specify 5 parameters, or 3, depending on how you count them. You have to specify the subject of the information. And by the way, when you're specifying all these parameters, you're doing them in contextually relevant ways. So you're specifying the role of the actors or the capacities in which the actors are acting. You're not saying never. You're saying never acting in a certain capacity, professor, parent, consumer, and in all the different ways that capacities in which we act, because that's relevant to the appropriateness of this flow. There's the sender of the information, the recipient of the information type, which is expressed in terms of the ontology of information that's relevant to a particular context. And then you have something like something that's new. Well, it's not that it's new; it's that it hasn't been discussed in previous privacy theories, which is called a transmission principle. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about that. So once again, this is very different from the accepted idea that subjects have control over information about ourselves. So that contextual integrity disagrees with that and says sometimes appropriate flow does not allow the subject to control information about him or herself. And I think this diverges from certain ideas of privacy as a fundamental right. I mean, depending on how you frame that, and this is a discussion, this is an argument that we can have with each other. It also disagrees with certain theories of privacy which assume that there are like two kinds of information, private information, public information. The public information, like everything, goes, but only with the private information do we have rules governing that information. And now, if you now understand this in terms of a model of the norm, what we're saying is that it's not sufficient to talk about the information type in this way. You need to have something that's, you have to conceptualize the information in a richer way. You can't just say private, public. And I've done some work that shows that people don't understand information in this, they don't have a dichotomy of information. There's some empirical work that a colleague and me have been doing. Now, I've posited these 5 parameters, and I would say that one of the lessons of machine learning and AI is that maybe there's a missing parameter in this norm, and that parameter is the parameter of use. Now, we'll see if I can get to it. I think in future iterations of the theory, we probably have to introduce this additional parameter because of various reasons, including the fact that we have just many new actors in the realm who don't have like when we now say physician, we know thousands of years this is a role that has been articulated in the context of healthcare. But if I say Google, platform, we don't yet know what that is. Now, often the law comes in, as they did in, I don't know how it is in many countries, but in the United States, when Congress passed the Telecommunication Act, that act was an act to define telecommunication provider. And that then was like a fast forward several thousand years, because suddenly we had an influential actor and we had to articulate the role or the capacity of that actor. And at the moment we're in a very active phase of new capacities that are emerging with the new technology, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this realm. So just to have you look through this, and the only element that I'm going to spend a little bit of time on is the transmission principle. So we're saying that the information flows. When you describe the information flow, you have to talk about the type of information that's flowing about one party, from one party to another party. And the transmission principle are essentially the conditions under which, or the constraints under which, the information flows. Now you can see it's not that consent is not important. It's just to see that consent is one among numerous, and I would say innumerable, transmission principles. And consent is a very important one, but it's most certainly not the only one. Sometimes we can coerce information. So if you're a witness in a court of law, the judge could coerce the information from you. And when I file my tax returns, it's not like, hey, Helen, would you please consent to providing this information? It's like, this is the information you need to provide. And when the police go in, and we discussed Fourth Amendment, to a home to search for some information, they need a warrant. So with a warrant is a transmission principle, and as you can see, there's reciprocity, there's with authorization, you can buy and sell information. So I like to give the example of you walk into a store, you see a shirt, you try it on, you walk out. What's wrong with that? You didn't pay, okay? So the payment is the transmission principle that allows this shirt that was here to now become your shirt. And that's how we think about the transmission principle. Here are just some, fake, made-up sentences that are describing flows of information for you to look at. And the point that I emphasize is that you need all the parameters matter. If you express a flow and you don't specify any of the parameters, and it could be implicit or explicit, you have provided a characterization of the flow that is incomplete and therefore ambiguous. Now, these norms, the norm structure and this idea of an informational norm serves in two ways. One is that when you're describing an information flow, if you want to give a full description of the flow for purposes of grasping whether privacy has been or contextual integrity has been respected or not, you need to express the flow by characterizing specifying all the parameters, or when you want to discover what the entrenched norm is, when you want to learn what people's expectations are, you need to extract all 5 parameters in order to fully understand what the expectation is. So it can describe a norm, or it can describe a practice. And I'm going to be very, this was for the longer version of the talk, but sometimes if you can use contextual integrity to perform a diagnostic. And for example, in one of the research projects that we were doing, looking at a mobile health app, it was a very simple mobile health app, but when you express it in terms of the contextual integrity norm, you can really carefully map, for the purpose of privacy evaluation, the relevant characteristic of the data flow. And what we were able to show with this data flow is how much the data was escaping from a closed circuit of a self-assessment tool, which this was to help people with back pain, and how much data was leaking unexpectedly to third parties, in this case Google, Facebook, and Force Therapeutics. Now, one of the other attempts to see how well contextual integrity is actually reflected, some of my colleagues had looked at the entire set of HIPAA privacy rules and found that for the most part the expression of the rules was very well captured by contextual integrity, so that when you want to be precise about rules, our policymakers are specifying the parameters, except there was a use parameter which gave us some cause to think we need this. And this particular work with Kirsten Martin, and there's a series of 3, the third study is location privacy, but what this study did was take past results about sensitivity of data. We found that there was people continued to rank this data according to different types of data in certain ways. I'm doing it too fast, but what happens is that when you add additional parameters to the question, so take something like health data, people judge it to be very sensitive, but when you present vignettes in which the health data is flowing to the physician, people are fine with it But when you say it's flowing to a data broker, they freak out. And we're like, well, duh, you know. But you can't get that when you hang the full privacy regulation on the sensitivity of the data without specifying the parameters. And we've done it. Okay. Hang on a sec. You're saying, wow. The problem is that, what happened here? Sorry, I don't know. My slides are a bit wonky. So what is the butt weight? What is the problem? The problem, even if you accept everything that I've said so far, you might say, but you know, this is an extremely conservative theory, because we're saying that contextual integrity depends on flow that conforms with entrenched norms. And so any flow that violates entrenched norms is a problem for contextual integrity. And all of this technology, which is the reason all of us who work in the area of privacy started working in the area of privacy, is incredibly disruptive. And so a theory that insists that nothing changes is conservative in a bad way, because many of us appreciate the great strength of the technologies. And so we want, in order for contextual integrity to be a theory that has ethical legitimacy, we need to look at these disruptive technologies, consider the disruption in the flows of information, and be able to evaluate. I can't read it. Is that? Yeah. And so here we are with this is where we last left off. And what the place we want to get to, okay, entrenched norms, is we want to say that the flow conforms not only with entrenched, but legitimate. We want to put in some ethical dimension into this theory. So what do we mean by legitimate contextual informational norms in a world where flows are constantly changing? And this is now the fourth in the four theses of contextual integrity, which is that in order to establish the legitimacy of contextual norms, or the legitimacy of the new flows, we go through an analysis that involves considering how the interests and preferences of the affected parties are affected. We consider the ethical and political principles, the societal values at stake, and you know, I've heard some of you talk about dignity. There could be certain free speech, autonomy, and so forth. But I'm only going to dwell on the third of these. And in order to do that, I want to mention a final characteristic of what a context is. And the context, all our contexts, what characterizes social context, are the ends, the purposes, and values that comprise the context. So if we came into an educational context, we come into a classroom, and you know, there's someone from Mars who is relaying information back to their leader to describe what's going on, and it's like, here are some people, and there's a teacher in front of the room, etc., but doesn't explain what the purpose of education is, or the purpose of healthcare, then the Martian leader will never understand what it is. So the purposes are definitive of the different contexts. And so the third of these the sets of reasoning are to discuss how the new flow is promotes the contextual function. You know, think about a criminal justice system. What are the purposes of the criminal justice system? In an early article that I worked with some information scientists, computer scientists, and a law student, what we did is to show how the proposition of placing court records online could either hurt or help the function of the criminal justice system, and not just does it hurt the plaintiff or the defendant, but rather whether it promotes the purpose of the criminal justice system as a measure of it, not just the interest of. And that is then the final and maybe most important feature of contextual integrity, is that, I don't know, if you go away and you remember two things, because one thing wouldn't be enough. If you remembered only two things about contextual integrity, you would remember that privacy is appropriate flow of information, finished. Second, that the value of contextual integrity, the reason a flow is appropriate, is not only that it's beneficial for the data subject or the information subject, but it promotes the ends, purposes, and values of the context. And in this, I follow Pris Regan's work, who was the first that I knew of who talked about the social value of privacy. And that's really important for contextual integrity. I'm just going to skip it. It's one of my favorite slides. And here's some possibilities for you saying, like, stop. All right, I'm going to stop, but that's it. Oh. Yeah, you should write in a heavy pen, so people like me. All right. Let's see.
So the first question would be, what would be your concluding remarks?
Well, no, that's it. This is it. If if you have questions about, let's see, where are we going?
So, Helen,
yeah.
You want to field questions?
Sure.
At your discretion.
Yeah. Okay.
So I love contextual integrity. It amazes me how many times I learned it and taught it, and still, like, every time I learn interesting new things. So this theory was accused, and you acknowledge that in the book and in your talk, of being conservative. And now you're talking about expanding it to use, or the context of use. And I have two questions about that. So first, would that mean bringing in more normative stand? And second, this theory was warmly embraced by the technological community. And if you're going to bring that additional normative stand, do you think that's going to harm its kind of status as uniformly accepted and in consensus?
Oh my God. I can only keep one question at a time in my jet-lagged brain. So no, it's okay. So you were saying, I think that most computer scientists, if they're going to implement contextual integrity in some way, and there are multiple different ways that I'm seeing this happen. We recently had a symposium on applications of contextual integrity, and it was some people in the HCI community are trying to use it to better inform people of what the flows are, and so I would say that 90% of the time the technical application is not going to be able to include the normative aspect. So let me just take a step back. Contextual integrity is not conservative it favors, it's only conservative in the sense that it favors entrenched norms. And there I think I was influenced reading Edmund Burke, where we have an assumption that we have a kind of settled agreement. So when something becomes normative, we understand that there are lots of interests and we've kind of arrived at this particular settled moment. Now, people who are critical theorists are correctly saying that sometimes the settled norm reflects not kind of a just allocation of resources or whatever it is, but sometimes rather reflects the interests of the powerful in society, and that's why you can't completely settle. And when we gain insight and so on, and we reflect on the norms, there are lots of different reasons for deciding that an entrenched norm is wrong. So it doesn't embrace conservatism completely. But back to computer science, I think the hope is that not the hope, but for the majority of the time, the computer science community isn't going to be able to use the legitimacy side. But the use part of it, and that's really interesting, because now I'm in a big NSF project with a lot of computer scientists. We are very interested in use, and in particular in we're interested in algorithmic transparency, because we want to see if we can identify decisions in a system. Let's say, take Google has recently taken over this is like an ongoing scandal where DeepMind obtained a lot of, the NHS data from about kidney disease, and they said, oh no, it's always going to stay within this gated community, and all of a sudden there was a big corporate shift, and all the health functionality has been shifted into Google at large. Now we're using Google, and we're finding, maybe we're curious, whether in our algorithmic relationship with Google, is Google actually using this information about kidney disease in a decision about us? I don't know, advertising is the thing we can test. It's not really important, advertising, but it happens to be things that we can test. And so what we're trying to do, what the computer scientists are trying to do in this kind of case, is to say, can we tell whether certain types of information have been used in certain kinds of algorithmically generated decisions about ourselves? So that's how I see that going. It's kind of limited, but it's... All right, yeah.
This is fascinating. You said that machine learning poses challenges.
Yes.
And I would like to hear your view about that, because it seems that what was allowed even 2 years ago, some people, you have events like Cambridge Analytica who've changed the norms. That some people who were very easy about their information might be less or more careful now. And so the question is, what happens when the norms shift in this world, because we understand more, whether we should be paternalistic, or whether we should give actual weight to performances of individuals.
Yeah. I don't have a good answer to your question, because we often, I don't have a good answer to your question, because we're saying that whatever the norms are depend on knowledge of what's going on. If the norm if, for example, I'll just give you an example. I don't know if it's not to do with machine learning, but the norm, it used to be you would go buy something, and then when you were paying, the cashier might say, oh, you know, what's your social security number? And when it became clear that this was potentially very damaging, people might have still continued to give their social security number, but the regulators said that this was wrong. And then they, there was a law that said you're not allowed to use the social security number. Now, people might have carried on doing it because they weren't aware that the social security number was problematic in that way. And so there is some kind of back and forth between paternalistic engagement. And therefore, I think the work that all of us in this room are trying to do is trying to expose what's going on under the hood so that regulators and ultimately people in the population will understand that things have to change. But you ask about machine learning, one of the great problems of machine learning is that we may have norms that govern the flow of certain information, and this, I mean, we all, this is what this is all about, but we know that from this information, either quite simply in the way Sherlock Holmes used to do it, or in far more complex ways, as we can derive from machine learning, understanding from the data that we all just give out rather freely to different parties. Now we aggregate, their practices of aggregation and inference drawing, and we're in a position where we need the norms to travel up and down this data food chain. And it might be happening, it used to happen slowly and we could adjust, and now it's happening so fast that the adjustment, it's hard, like we need to figure out how to cope with adjustment. I mean, I have certain, and one of the ways of coping with the adjustment is also to be stricter about about regulating users.
First, thank you very much. Very, very interesting. I just have a thought. Do you think that advancement in new technologies like zero-proof knowledge or shared secret, like things like dualities and others, that actually enable you to utilize the data, but in a reduced form, by that actually you do not have access anymore to my data, but you can derive users from the data, would in a sense change this concept that we might have societal rights in data or ability to use the data if we keep it in a form that it is still, in a sense, protecting the privacy.
So again, I mean, this is a very intriguing area that we've entered into. Some of the things like zero knowledge and homomorphic encryption and so on are very good for certain what we call, maybe what I would call privacy threat models, which is to say, you have two parties, they know that it's good for them to exchange data for each of them, but there's this problem and so on, and then they cooperate in a way of exchanging the data that isn't problematic from a privacy point of view. And in those cases, that's great, and I think we should keep developing those technologies. But in other instances, the threat model simply does not allow that. I would love to have a zero-knowledge way of performing search on a search engine. But the search engine is like, sorry, no can do. And I feel this way. There's a lot of interest in blockchain and privacy. It feels to me that this works great when all the parties are in agreement with it. But it has limited use in the world in which we live, because they don't you're.
But if you are back to theory, and I know your pivotal work, like on my right to privacy vis-a-vis Google, about the questions I asked. Companies, I think, like duality, but there are a few others, make you now a model that I keep the privacy of the one who does the inquiries.
Yeah.
Because you can protect
No, I
only the
understand.
inquiry and what I'm doing.
Yeah.
In the reverse, the data would not be exposed, only the insights.
Yes.
So I can derive societal insights
Yes.
from the data without exposing the private data.
Well, there are different ways. Again, you know, first of all, back to what I said before, that'll work when the parties are cooperating parties. When I don't know if you were here yesterday when I briefly showed the example of Mastercard and Google collaborating. Now, it depends on the ways in which they perform this match, because when both of the companies said that we're not exchanging information, identification information, what they meant is that, you know, they didn't say, you know, Nive Elkin-Koren clicked on this ad and then she went to the Birkenstock store and bought a pair of shoes. They said, you know, they had some maybe opaque identifier that connected these two activities. If the company says, okay, now we've performed this analysis and we see this interesting outcome, but we'll never be able to go back to Nive Elkin-Koren through this number, but rather it's a general insight about something and other things, then we could say we want to ask the question of whether this particular activity it becomes a question, and I think there were people who talked about proportionality, whether the surveillance of individuals in order to extract certain knowledge about the population is acceptable. And then the problem is a different problem. The problem is about the values and whether it's worth subjecting people to certain kinds of surveillance in order to extract that. But that's the question. And that's as it should be. That's what contextual integrity wants you to do. It wants you to look at those values at the end of the day in order to establish whether certain flows are appropriate or not.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you about these emergent flows when there are no prior norms. I'm still a bit confused by these cases. So, for example, I was this year using a bike-sharing app in Berlin, which turned out to be Chinese, and from what I could understand from the app interface, it was starting to build a part of a social credit score for me in a Chinese data system. It has a score of a good writer. It says interesting things like, we'll check whether you stop on red lights. Obviously, they're not doing that in Berlin, but it's there. As a user, there's no context for that, right? There's no like expectation of either privacy or lack of privacy for me because it's so alien. So I get your point that it needs to be constructed, this norm, and that's why I understand your point about this legitimate norm. But don't you think in such cases, in practice, everyone will fall back just to privacy, to human rights as the only secure point of reference, and you're trying to avoid that?
No, well, it's not that I'm trying to avoid it, and I'm not saying that human rights doesn't come. The human rights part comes into like the middle there of the analysis.
Right,
but okay, let me respond in a sec. So let's take the bike app and forget whether it's Chinese or German, and even think about, I mean, there's quite a lot now written about intelligence that's being placed not only in vehicles but also in the environment around the vehicle, so that we can figure out whether you ran the red light or not. And we can say that, first of all, this is a disruption because, 10, 20 years ago, this information wasn't available. Now, if you're following the contextual informational norm structure, the first thing you want to do, this is a very let's roll up our sleeves and actually do the analysis, is, who's the data subject, who's getting the information, under what constraints, and so on. So like before we can even discuss it, we look at the actual flows that emerge from your use of this particular app. And sometimes you don't even know the answer to the question. And we compare it to the existing flows or the flows from a while ago. And then we perform the ethical analysis. Now, I would, because I'm really attracted to that last question about the contextual ends, purposes, and values, I would press people to discuss the extent to which this novel flow that this bike app is providing you, in what ways it serves functions, ends, and purposes of the particular context. And as you say, that human rights is not going to provide the end of the story, because you'll have to go through the calibration of some particular right with some other particular right, and one of the considerations then are the contextual ends and purposes. I know it's like a more complex answer than you wanted, but that's the roll up your sleeves and actually jump in and do the analysis.
Thank you very much. Helen coming in and giving 2 keynotes in 24 hours. That's, you should have a superhero. That sadly is Danny. And now we turn to our director, Yoni.
Lunch is just behind. Lunch is just behind this door. Okay? And during lunch, we're going to have a screening of AI in arts videos. They're created by Dr. Leo Zamanson. Dr. Leo Zamanson is a lecturer, he's assistant professor here at the University of Haifa in the Information and Knowledge Management Department. His research interests include social media, online engagement, commitment, internet business models, creative experimentation, sharing economy, and algorithmic management. And he's also the founder of the Prince Screens Festival. It's Israel's digital culture festival, which connects internet researchers, activists, and artists. So please take your lunch, okay, and come back here to this room. And we're going to have a screening of this screen.
I just wanted to mention to everybody that we've just announced postdocs available at Cornell Tech for this sort of work, ethics, law, technology. So if you're interested, go online and